Hello and welcome to the Third Sector podcast. I'm Lucinda Rouse.
And I'm Emily Burt. Each week we bring you half an hour of discussion and debate about the important goings-on in the charity world. Now this week is somewhat different to usual, as Lucinda, you and your Mike have been on site at one of the country's major charities.
Yes, I was released from the studio and went down to Poole, to the headquarters of the Royal National Lifeboat Institution, or RNLI. It's a very special year for the charity because they're celebrating their 200th anniversary. And as you'd imagine, they've made a big deal of that, and their history is a very important part of their identity today. I spoke to several people at RNLI, including the Chief Executive, Mark Dowie, and I asked him how the charity reconciles its legacy with the realities of today.
Well, I think the RNLI has evolved throughout its existence. When it was first set up, it was really designed to rescue people from ships that had crashed into the coast. We're now doing much more rescue at sea, much more casualty care. We're providing a much more comprehensive service, if you like, around all of those coasts. We've got to stay with the times. We rely completely on volunteers. We have to look after the ones we've got, and we've got to encourage the next generation to come in and help. And that's all sorts of volunteers. So staying modern and moving with the times is something RNLI has always done. And if we hadn't, we'd still be rowing our boats. We've changed our kit, we've changed the way we deliver things, and we've moved with the times. And that will always be the case.
Has it been challenging in the past few years, particularly since COVID, to get the volunteer numbers that you need?
It's always a challenge to achieve resilience around the coast. And we rely on the volunteers we have, very proud of them actually, but we work very hard to ensure that there is succession coming through. And from time to time that gets stretched, but in general we've got a very loyal volunteer base, and luckily for us that continues, and we'll carry on working on it. It's the thing that allows us to do our work, so we have to focus on it.
And focus on it they certainly do. As well as speaking to Mark, I saw some of their on-site facilities, including a training centre for the RNLI crew and lifeguards. I observed some lifeguard training in their indoor training pool, and that's where those sounds you just heard were recorded, complete with choppy waves and sound effects to recreate the atmosphere of a storm.
It's really interesting to hear Mark reflecting on that very long legacy of the charity and the idea that it was initially people who were being wrecked off the coast of the UK. I think something that is very unique and very strong about the RNLI, and has been ever since I started working at Third Sector, is that they are so clear and concise in their core messaging, and I think that is really important to keeping the charity true to its mission as it learns to evolve, or if we're going in with the boat puns, making it able to turn with the tide. They are about saving lives at sea, and that is such a simple but such a strong message that then can be applied to whatever context it is that they're working with. And the RNLI in recent years has faced a lot of pressure from far-right groups and from politicians who don't agree with the work that they do to help people who are seeking asylum in this country, who are in distress in the Channel or around the coast. They've been referred to as like a taxi service for immigrants by certain people in the past, and they can always bring it back to, we are here to save lives at sea, regardless. That is what we do. And then the other thing that I think is really unique about this as a charity is that volunteer model that Mark Dowie was speaking about a moment there.
Yes, you have touched on a number of areas that we are going to go on to cover in the course of this episode. Now, Mark's retiring from the position of Chief Executive at the end of this month after 5 years at the helm. Before that, he worked in a completely different area. He held very senior positions at Standard Chartered Bank. But he does have a long-standing association with the RNLI, and in fact, he himself joined as a volunteer.
I've volunteered and supported charities all my life. And I'd been a trustee of several charities before, so it was not my first interaction with charities. I had in fact retired from banking in 2016, and the first thing I did was then go to my local lifeboat station and volunteer. And so I had 3 years volunteering at Salcombe Lifeboat Station on the operational side. And then this job came up, and I couldn't resist it. It seemed to me just a wonderful way to bring together my love of the sea, and a very long-standing relationship with the sea as a sailor and also as a naval officer. Also the things that I'd done along the way in my career. In a way, I'd served the longest apprenticeship ever for this job.
So he's been a long-time volunteer and involved in the voluntary sector in that way, but this was the first actual charity job for Mark. And I asked him how his corporate background informed his approach to leading the RNLI.
Well, the RNLI is an unusual charity. I think although almost every charity would probably say the same thing, we're quite a complex collection of different sorts of things. We build our boats, so we have 3 factories manufacturing things. We're a big engineering operation, maintenance operation, training organisation. We deliver an emergency service. We have a seasonal lifeguard service, and we're an educator. And then, of course, a fundraiser. So it's a complex collection of activities. And I think my previous career, all elements of it, have contributed in different ways to different bits of all of that. And I think it's important to have had those sorts of experiences outside an organisation like this if you're going to run an organisation as complex as this. To give you an example, COVID-19 hit. We overnight had to go virtual, and we had to change almost everything we did and the way we did it overnight. And my experience actually within the banking sector around crisis management, around shifting gears, focusing on the fundamentals of performance, right down to where's the cash coming from, we did that really super quickly. And that came from my time as chief executive of the wholesale bank in Standard Chartered, where you were again reacting to issues and reacting very quickly. So I think that was useful, and I probably wouldn't have done things in quite the same way had I come from a different background, maybe.
We'll get to some specifics on how Mark recalibrated the RNLI in response to COVID and other challenges a little bit later. But first, I asked Mark about the biggest changes he's made to the running of the RNLI.
I'd seen the RNLI from the other end of the telescope, if you like. I'd been a station volunteer. I knew that there were some things I'd like to improve on. I suppose the most profound thing I felt was that the best decisions are made when they're as close as possible to where their impact is delivered. I wanted to get the RNLI back in a place where action was taken regionally and locally, and move away from a very central approach to life. So that was something I'd set out very early on in my time, my first week actually. And we've worked very hard to do that over the course of the past 5 years, and I think the results are actually a much closer relationship between the centre of the RNLI, where you are today, the support centre, and everything that happens around the coast of the UK and Ireland. We care for our staff and volunteers equally. In my time, we've set out a culture of something we call One Crew. It really is built around the fact that everyone is making a contribution, a valuable contribution to what we do. And we've hammered that home over 5 years. And for me, it's a very important part of what I feel happy about leaving behind.
I think the One Crew idea is a very interesting one, isn't it? Because I suppose when you are in that emergency situation, you do all have to work really instinctively as a team, and having that really strong organisational culture is something which is so important to so many charitable organisations, particularly when they work in such challenging circumstances. But it's very interesting to hear how that kind of, I suppose, that naval attitude, in a way, it's really been implemented across all kinds of levels of this organisation. And I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts on how that influences, I guess, the mood at the charity. What's the feel of it like down there at headquarters?
Yeah, it was really interesting. And obviously I can't comment on what it was like under previous leaderships, but certainly this idea of the one crew policy was reflected in the fact that everybody, from Mark himself all the way down, were wearing some form of RNLI uniform or stash. You know, there was a really, really strong sense of brand and identity. And I suppose it's really important to do that, particularly when you're working at all corners of the United Kingdom and Ireland, when so much of your work is dependent on volunteers. It's very, very important that you've got that sense of one.
And it's really recognisable as well. That is what I would say about the RNLI colours, that really punchy yellows and the oranges and the reds. When I'm going along the coast, I can always spot an RNLI life station. And I'm not sure I could say that about any other kind of seafaring or any other rescue charity. I'm sure there are plenty more in this country, but there is a really, really strong recognition element there, which I think is great.
So back to some of the challenges that Mark has had to tackle whilst at the RNLI. He arrived in 2019, so very shortly before COVID, which was swiftly followed by the cost of living crisis.
Inflation has had an impact on the charity. I've spent a lot of my time planning, replanning, reprioritising, changing, transforming to try to meet those challenges. We have a tricky supply chain for our manufacturing and for other areas of the operation. That's required a lot of thought. It's been around doubling down on what is going to make the boat go faster, being very clear about the value of our donors' contribution and ensuring that we're wasting as little of their hard-earned money as possible. And it's just relentless grinding focus on what is efficient, what isn't efficient, what is necessary, absolutely necessary, what isn't absolutely necessary. That's not something you do with one big bang transformation, then everything's all well. You've got to stay focused on that. And it becomes a bit of a grind, honestly. You have to stay focused on it relentlessly, or it'll get away from you again. And so that, for me, it's just been a sort of hard-nosed look at everything over and over again.
Could you give me a specific example of any efficiency that you're particularly proud of or that was particularly major in terms of change?
So it's things like, this came from my banking career actually, things like energy. You know, we have 238 lifeboat stations, about 60 lifeguard support units, and about 500 buildings of different sorts scattered around the coast, all using energy. Now, we used to buy our energy at the meter, depending on where we were. Very early on in my time, we put in place a wholesale energy strategy, which, as a result of the work we did, was delivering savings of around £2 million a year to the charity. So it's stuff like that that hadn't necessarily been thought of before, that we brought in new disciplines to ensure we're not wasting money.
So, as he said, a hard-nosed approach to efficiency. And at this point, we're going to cut to some of the complex operations that Mark was referring to and head over to the All-Weather Lifeboat Centre, or the lifeboat factory, across the road from his office. And it's here where new lifeboats are built and older ones are brought back in to be refitted. The latest class of all-weather lifeboat is called the Shannon, named after the river in Ireland, and you'll hear it mentioned several times.
My name is Daniel Sharp. I'm Production Control Manager for the All-Weather Lifeboat Centre here in Poole. So at the moment we're on the second floor of the All-Weather Lifeboat Centre, and we've got a viewing gallery which looks out over the boat hall where we build our new Shannon class lifeboats, and we refit our existing fleet with various different boats in for refit.
And it's all an in-house team?
Yes, it is, yeah. So we've designed the Shannon in-house years ago, and we're now building. We've got about 150 production staff here, all employed by the RNLI. We build 4 Shannon-class lifeboats a year. We've just completed our 52nd, and we have 6 boats in build at any one time in the factory.
It's a long process.
Yeah, so from start to finish, it takes us around 17 months.
Well, perhaps we could go and have a look round. Have your material costs gone up? a lot?
Yeah, so part of the justification for building this factory was that we were concerned that there wasn't many options, at least for competitive contracting of the Shannon class lifeboat. The first 13 boats were built externally, but we wanted to make sure that we were getting the best price for a Shannon. We also had our refit activity as well, so we were refitting boats all around the coast, and some of those yards had gone bust. So we were worried about being able to guarantee our ability to both maintain our boats and build new boats. So the decision, after a lot of work and calculations, the decision was taken to build this factory. And once we brought Shannon in, we were actually able to bring the cost of the boat down. 1.8 million is what we got it down to. And we were able to hold that price for approximately 6 years, up until this past year, where inflation has now increased the cost of our materials to the point where it's now at 2 million. But we were originally paying £2.2 million for a lifeboat. So to be in the position where we've been able to hold that price below that number is actually a justification for why we have this factory, and it's in our interest to be able to reduce that cost. Cool, we're now in the paint booths, and the paint team are just coming in from their tea break, which is good. So we have 3 paint booths, and we can see the colour of the whole wheelhouse is white, and that's because it's had its primer applied. And that's the coats that go down to prep the surface before we then put the typical orange paint. We always joke, so you can have any colour as long as it's blue and orange. So yeah, we're just at the primer stage in there.
What's the best part of this process for you? Like, what's the favourite part of what you do?
I think for me, I've got quite a link with the Shannon class. I started out as a designer, a naval architect, as part of the design team for Shannon. So I was 16 years ago put into the team that we designed that boat from scratch, and then I've kind of moved around to the point where I've kind of overseen the build of every one of them so far, and now to be managing the factory. So whenever we get a new boat out and we launch it, we have a small ceremony where we ring a bell. And that for me is a real magical moment, because we're marking that the first time that boat's hitting the water in 50 years of service, hopefully. So it's such a huge thing, and it sort of solidifies everything we're doing and says, like, we're doing a great job. We're building boats that go and save lives, and they're going to do that for a number of years. So yeah, that for me is the best bit. And seeing the crew, they sometimes come down for those launching ceremonies, and they are just so excited to be getting their new boat. It's magical time. So
fantastic.
I just want to say that what I absolutely love about that is the small act of kind of the bell ring to launch a new ship. You know, ship launching is an old tradition that kind of goes way, way back, and you see it in sort of Viking times. In Georgia, of course, the one that everyone knows is that you kind of tend to break a bottle of wine or a bottle of champagne over the prow, but there are all kinds of things that people used to do as a kind of a good luck gesture to their boats going out onto the water, hang them with flowers. I think, you know, back in the pagan times, often you would kill someone. I'm quite glad the RNLI aren't doing that to launch their boats, but there's a really nice kind of sense of that tradition and that luck element in there, which I think is great. Good for them.
Yeah, and Dan's enthusiasm for his job and for the whole process was absolutely infectious. That was a very, very abbreviated snippet of the tour that he gave me of all the processes from start to finish of building and fitting out a lifeboat. It was such fun going around the centre with him, and also just really appreciating what Mark was talking about the scale and complexity of the operation, how big some of these boats are, just at, you know, a very crude level, but also coming all the way down from the far corners of Scotland and elsewhere for their maintenance. So let's go back to Mark. Along with the storms of COVID and the cost of living crisis, a really challenging aspect of the past few years has been the way that the RNLI has been dragged into the issue of small boats crossing the channel.
That, for me, was a challenge on 2 fronts. First of all, it's a politically polarising debate, and so dealing with that from the charity's perspective was tough. But secondly, for the people involved, you know, there are 8 lifeboat stations who are doing this work. The volume of their work has gone up exponentially, 5-6 times, and supporting them and developing new techniques for mass casualty rescue, working with other partners who are active in the channel, all of that has been tough for us too. we're not immune from criticism. Small boat crossings in particular have been very polarising politically. But we know that we're a much loved charity delivering a service right around the coast of the UK and Ireland, and that people get us. It's just grown in my time. It's been a profound realisation that the purpose that was set out by our founder in 1824 is still the one we're delivering to today. And we've been through 2 world wars, Ireland becoming a separate country, a whole load of other challenges in that time. And this was just another one.
You're about to leave your position. Is there anything that you would have done differently in terms of how you've responded to that?
Absolutely not. No. I mean, I think there are 2 things that, for me, which had to be said, were said, and haven't really had to be said again as a result, were this is our purpose. We've been doing it for 200 years. And we are fully in support of the people doing this work, and we are very proud of them. Said it once, said it properly. I think everyone's very clear about our stance.
And it's fantastic that you got such a surge of support from people after you made that very bold statement and have continued to do so. But there was a risk at the beginning, wasn't there?
Well, I think there's always a risk. We don't actually know why someone puts 10p in a bucket. You've no idea. And you actually have to ask them why they do it. We don't measure the motivations behind our kind donors and their donations. All you can do is be very honestly glue-like to your purpose. If you stick to that and you do it relentlessly, you won't go wrong.
And that's quite an interesting response to my question, I think. Mark was very, very clear throughout the interview about the fact that the RNLI is totally apolitical. He also said that it's not a campaigning organisation, and he refused to be drawn into any discussion about the current state of society and what that means for the charity sector and how government is potentially complicit in the environment that the sector finds itself in today.
Absolutely. But I do think, just to pick up on that, something that is absolutely interesting is I think the RNLI has always been very clear that it's a humanitarian charity. And as I was saying earlier, it always comes back to that. We save lives at sea. This is what we do. But I think the effectiveness of that messaging is so powerful that really speaks to people. And we see this play out in the surges, as you said in your interview, of donations that the RNLI do get whenever, certain people attempt to drag them in to a political war or to a culture war. I mean, I remember in 2021, there was a period where the charity received a lot of criticism from people, including Nigel Farage, who made that comment about, I think I mentioned earlier, the taxi service for immigration, illegal immigration. And I remember that, there was a 24-hour window where the RNLI saw a 2,000% increase in donations over one 24-hour period alone, which just goes to show actually how powerful that messaging really is and how people do respond to it when they see it trying to be kind of dragged into a fight that it's actually not a part of.
And again, just going back time and time again to the sense of purpose.
Mm.
There have also been some internal issues while Mark has been at the head of the RNLI, and I asked him a little bit about that, specifically where certain members of staff felt that there had been multiple instances of sexism and female members of staff feeling that it was very difficult for them to get ahead as a result of their gender.
Okay, so I think 2 things to say. First of all, women have played a huge role in the charity from the word go. We know that we have a need to grow the population of women in operational roles. It was one of my key aims when I set out my strategy 5 years ago, and we have been growing that and encouraging it. We have a long way to go, though. And that's for 2 reasons. One, it's right, clearly right. There's nothing on a lifeboat that a man can do that a woman can't do. Nothing. So it's right that we go that way. And also, it can only contribute to the resilience of the service that we provide. If we're trying to recruit from 100% of the population rather than just 50%, clearly that's going to help. The incidents you refer to, they happen to relate to gender, but they are no different from any other sort of bad behaviour We're super clear about what's expected. We're super clear about our desire to deal with it when it happens, and that will just carry on.
What measures have you introduced to try and get more women into your volunteer base and your staff?
Well, countless, actually. I mean, you referred to the factory earlier on. We have a very strong group, Women in Engineering group, that encourages people local to here, because that's where the factory workers come from, encourages women and girls to come and see what a career in engineering is all about. We champion our female role models in all our different roles, and we've been a forerunner actually of encouraging women to come into search and rescue generally. So we're very active indeed, and I go back to the point, there is nothing that a woman can't do in the RNLI, nothing. And the ones who are here now would be pretty miffed if you told them there was. I can tell you, I wouldn't want to tell them that. It's a really core contribution to the RNLI that our women give.
So it'll be interesting to see the work that the team continue to do in this area. But we're going to jump again to another part of my tour of the RNLI headquarters and into the archive, which was really interesting. And as you will hear, there was a lot to say about the role of women at the charity throughout its history.
My name's Hayley Whiting. I'm the RNLI's Heritage Archive and Research Manager, so I look after our historic records. Our heritage is really one of the things that makes the RNLI so unique, and we are really that resource to share all the amazing stories of bravery and courage, but also innovation and technology. And yeah, we've been able to support the RNLI to share all those amazing stories.
So what have we got in front of us here?
Yeah, so I've got a few items from our collection that I thought would be interesting to have a chat through. Photographs is something that the RNLI is very strong on. We have photographs for all of our current lifeboat stations and nearly 200 stations that we have operated in the past. On the table we've got a picture of a very standard crew. They're in their kapok life jackets. This is 1930s, stood out in front of the boathouse. A lot like you would have a picture of our crew today, but again just showing the difference in the safety equipment and the boats. And the other photo is of women launching lifeboats at Dungeness Station. And this is really to help illustrate the role of women in our history. So women have been able to join the crew since 1969, but women have always been really involved with lifeboats and the charity, either through fundraising, but here physically pulling the lifeboat out of its lifeboat house to launch, which is an incredibly difficult thing to do. It's also quite a dangerous thing to do. And there were a number of stations where women were on standby to help to get the boat out to rescue people.
And then we've got another document by the looks of it.
Yeah, so this is an unassuming document. It says on the front Margate, and then it says 30th of May 1940, and then it says Dunkirk evacuation. So the RNLI was involved in rescuing the troops off the beaches of Dunkirk. The Admiralty had called the RNLI and said, please could you get as many lifeboats to Dover as possible? And what they were looking for were boats that could go into the shallower water and retrieve the soldiers off the beaches. Ramsgate and Margate were called directly, and they went out with their crews on board. And this is a service return, which is what the crews fill out today, just online. And this is describing what they did in those rescues. 17 other lifeboats also went out, and between them will have saved tens of thousands of the soldiers. But if we open this one up, you can see there's lots of bits of paperwork, but it's essentially describing what happened, and you can see that they think that they saved 600 men. We think that's a really low estimate of what they did, because they were not counting. It was a very stressful situation under enemy fire. But between Ramsgate and Margate, we know that they saved over 3,000 soldiers, which is truly phenomenal. But really just illustrates that wartime spirit of our crews, but also the fact that from 1824 to the present day, we will go out not knowing necessarily who we're going out to save, but we will do that. And that was volunteer crews going over to the beaches.
So that was an absolutely fascinating look into the archive and the history of the RNLI. But back to Mark and to the conditions in which the charity is operating today. I did ask him about the state of the sector more generally. You asked me earlier on, Emily, about my feeling of going to the headquarters and you know, the sort of uniformity, the clarity of purpose, the sense that everybody was there for the same reason. But also it does feel like a bit of an outlier sort of in the sector in terms of the fact that it's delivering these huge operations all around the country. Like, it is very different to what a lot of other, or any other charity. I mean, it's unique in terms of what it does as a charity, even within the sort of emergency response sector. But Mark did have some thoughts on how it is continuing to operate in the face of a very challenging wider voluntary sector environment.
This organisation, you know, it's lasted 200 years for a reason. It's resilient, its people are committed, it's imaginative, and it will adapt.
And how do you feel about the voluntary sector more generally, of which the RNLI is a big part? It's going through a very difficult time. At Third Sector, we've reported more charities going bust and closing in the past 6 or 7 months than we have in the past decade.
Yes, and there have been more corporate bankruptcies in the last 24 months than there have been at any time since the early 1990s. You know, I mean, it's a tough environment, and it's incumbent on the people who are leading the charities and the charities themselves to cut their cloth and continue to deliver. And I think that's tough. That's very hard. We've had to work hard to put ourselves in a sustainable, solid position. Work really hard. I feel very sad when I see a charity go, because its purpose was real and the people who believed in that purpose were real, and very often the service it was providing just disappears. It's very sad, but it is an unfortunate result of what's going on generally.
I think all charities are working really hard and making those difficult decisions that Mark talks about there. You know, I guess my observation would be, you know, you mentioned we've seen a lot of charities closing down. From my part, there is no organisation about which I would say, oh, they've closed their doors because they haven't worked hard enough to stay open. Now, I'm sure that's not what Mark was implying, but I think that resilience and that operational kind of instinct to just kind of keep running and to keep going no matter what is something which is really present across the sector. It's great to hear that, you know, the RNLI is doing so much work in this area and being so strategic, but I think you would see that at any number of small charities or medium-sized organisations, less well-known organisations, as you would at the RNLI. But he does hit the nail on the head in that I think that is, you know, it's a real backbone of how this sector functions. Lucinda, that sounds like an absolutely fascinating visit. I'm really glad you were able to share some of your time there with us. And that's it for this week. We'll be back next week to find out how one charity has ventured into the world of enterprise to diversify its income streams. In the meantime, please do leave us a rating on the podcast platform that you use to listen to this show. And as ever, we'd love to receive any feedback you'd like to give us via our short survey. It's always open, and you can find the link to fill it in the show notes to this episode. For now, though, that's goodbye from Lucinda, from myself, and our producer, Nav Powell.